My name is Lydia Crane. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, I've been described as steady, dependable. The kind of woman people trust with responsibilities, but rarely with complexity. I've always had a job that sounds sensible when you explain it to relatives. I've always paid my bills on time. I've always been the person others rely on when something needs to be handled quietly and correctly. Because of that, people tend to underestimate me in ways that are difficult to challenge without seeming defensive. They mistake calm for passivity. They confuse politeness with agreement. They assume that because I don't fight for attention, I don't value my own position. And when I got married, those assumptions didn't disappear. They simply rearranged themselves into something more intimate, more personal. This story isn't about a marriage that exploded. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic ultimatums, no single betrayal that made everything obvious. What happened was quieter than that, more socially acceptable. It was about an expectation my husband carried so naturally that he never thought to ask me about it. That after marriage, I would quit my job. That my working life was something temporary, flexible, negotiable. I didn't agree, at least not in the way he assumed, and not in the way silence is often mistaken for consent. I want to be clear about the tone of what you're about to hear. This is not a revenge story. There's no humiliation, no public reckoning, no moment where I raise my voice and reclaim power in a single sentence. This is a story about emotional justice, the kind that unfolds slowly through awareness rather than confrontation. It's about psychological reversal that happens not because someone is defeated, but because someone else finally stops disappearing. You'll hear about how I was perceived before marriage and how easy it was for others to place me into a role I never formally accepted. You'll hear about small moments that didn't seem worth reacting to at the time, about how practicality can be used as a leash, about how being reasonable can slowly turn into being erased. This story is also about work, not just employment, but identity, about what it means when someone you love sees your ambitions as optional, about how love, when paired with unexamined expectations, can quietly shrink a life, and about a truth I came to understand much later than I wish I had. Love shouldn't require erasure. I'm telling this story without drama because drama was never the point. The real shift didn't happen out loud. It happened internally through observation, documentation, restraint, and eventually, choice. The kind of choice that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but changes the balance completely. If you're listening to this and you've ever been praised for being easygoing while slowly feeling yourself fade into the background, the story may feel familiar. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm only here to tell you exactly what happened when I stopped assuming expectations were harmless. So as you listen, I invite you to stay with the quiet moments. Pay attention to what's implied rather than spoken, because sometimes the most decisive turning points arrive without announcement. Have you ever realized, slowly, uncomfortably, that something expected of you was never something you truly agreed to? Before I was a wife, before my marriage became the defining lens through which people interpreted my choices, I was already someone others felt comfortable defining. To my family, I was the sensible one, the daughter who didn't worry them, the one whose life seemed orderly enough that no one felt the need to ask many questions. I wasn't the dramatic success story or the cautionary tale. I existed in the middle space, competent, stable, quietly progressing. They spoke about me with relief, not curiosity. At work, I was known as reliable, the person who remembered details others forgot, the one who smoothed tensions in meetings without making it obvious. My supervisors trusted me because I didn't challenge them publicly. My colleagues leaned on me because I made things easier. I was valued, but in a way that never threatened anyone else's authority or identity. And socially, I was often described as easy to be around. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't interrupt. I didn't compete for space. I learned early that being agreeable made rooms feel safer for everyone except me. None of this felt like a burden at the time. In fact, It felt like a form of success. I had internalized the idea that visibility was risky and usefulness was protection. If I were needed, I couldn't be discarded. If I were calm, I wouldn't be challenged. If I didn't ask for too much, I wouldn't be asked to leave. So when I met my husband, it made sense that he saw me through the same lens everyone else did. He often described me as low maintenance. He said he admired my independence, my work ethic, and my practicality. He liked that I didn't need constant reassurance, that I didn't demand attention, that I seemed content without making noise about it. What I didn't realize then was that people often admire qualities they intend to benefit from. When we started talking about the future, casually at first, hypothetically, he spoke in broad strokes. About stability, about family, about how things usually work. And because his tone was calm and reasonable, I didn't immediately notice how often those visions centered his life continuing uninterrupted, while mine adjusted quietly around it. When friends talked about us, they framed me as the adaptable one. Lydia will figure it out. She's flexible. She doesn't mind change. None of them said this maliciously. In fact, it was said with confidence, as if my identity had already been settled. And maybe that's the hardest part to explain. No one ever told me outright that my needs mattered less. No one explicitly dismissed my ambitions. They simply assumed I would bend. And because I always had, their assumption felt safe to them. I played my role well. I showed up. I supported. I minimized inconvenience. I absorbed expectations without naming them. And in doing so, I slowly became someone others felt entitled to plan around. Even I didn't question it at first. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like absence. It feels like peace. You don't cause friction. You don't disrupt narratives. You don't force conversations people aren't ready to have. And for a long time, I believed that meant I was mature, evolved, secure. But invisibility has a cost. It teaches people not to check in, not to ask, not to listen closely. Because from the outside, everything appears fine. So when marriage entered the picture, when roles became more formal and expectations more permanent, no one thought it necessary to clarify where I stood. My position had already been silently agreed upon by everyone except me. I was the woman who would adjust. Not because I had promised to, not because I wanted to, but because I always had before. And that version of me, the dependable, adaptable, quietly competent woman, was the version everyone felt most comfortable keeping. I didn't yet understand how dangerous that comfort could become. The first moment didn't arrive with weight. That's what made it easy to dismiss. We were sitting at the kitchen table, still in the early stretch of marriage where everything feels provisional, like a rehearsal for a life that hasn't fully started yet. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and dish soap. There was nothing tense in the air. He was relaxed, comfortable, certain. He mentioned it almost in passing. Once we're settled, it probably won't make sense for you to keep working like this. Not if, not would you want to. Just a practical observation, based on the way people comment on the weather or traffic. I remember nodding, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The difference mattered to me. It didn't matter to him. He continued, explaining his reasoning as if it were self-evident. His job was more demanding. His income had a clearer growth path. Someone needed to be available, flexible, and unencumbered. And because he spoke calmly, without condescension, it sounded almost reasonable. Almost? I asked a question, not a challenge, just curiosity. What do you mean? He smiled, the way people do when they think they're reassuring you. I just mean you won't have to work anymore. Not like this. We'll be married. Things change. There it was, the cut. Not deep enough to bleed. Not sharp enough to provoke alarm, just enough to register. I remember thinking that I should respond more clearly. That this was one of those moments people talk about later and say, I wish I'd said something then. But the moment slid past me. It was late. We were tired, and I told myself there would be time to revisit it. That's how small cuts work. They rely on postponement. Later, when I mentioned the conversation to a friend, she laughed softly. That's just how guys think. He's probably trying to take care of you. My mother framed it as a compliment. It means he feels responsible now. That's not a bad thing. Even I softened it when I repeated it out loud. I removed the edges. I made it sound mutual. I said we talked about maybe adjusting work after marriage, as if the assumption hadn't been unilateral. But I remembered exactly how it felt. What stayed with me wasn't the suggestion itself. It was the certainty behind it. The way my job had already been reclassified as temporary, the way my consent was implied rather than requested. After that, there were other moments, still small, still ignorable. Comments about how stressful my work schedule was. Observations about how much easier things would be if I didn't have to worry about deadlines. Jokes about me being free someday. Each one delivered lightly, affectionately, with no hint of malice. And every time I felt the same quiet resistance rise in me. And just as quietly, I pressed it down. I told myself this was normal. That marriage required compromise, that he wasn't trying to control me. He was planning a future. And planning requires assumptions, doesn't it? But there was a pattern forming, whether I wanted to see it or not. His life trajectory remained fixed and central. Mine was treated as adjustable, optional, secondary. What unsettled me most was how invisible my reaction was to everyone else. No one saw a problem because I didn't make one visible. I didn't argue. I didn't object forcefully. I didn't say no. I simply remembered. There's a difference between silence and forgetting. Silence collects information. Forgetting lets it dissolve. I began to notice how often decisions were discussed as if they were already made. How often was my role framed as support rather than participation? How often the future was described without asking where I stood in it? None of this was dramatic enough to confront. That was the trap. Each moment on its own seemed too small to justify discomfort, too subtle to challenge without seeming unreasonable. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed calm, I stayed quiet, I stayed observant. And somewhere beneath that calm, something began to harden, not into anger, but into clarity. The first small cut didn't hurt because of what it took away. It hurt because of what it revealed. Once something is said out loud, even casually, it changes the shape of the room. After that first conversation, I became more aware of how often my working life was spoken about as if it were a phase. Something transitional I just hadn't outgrown yet. At first, I treated each comment as an isolated incident, a poorly worded joke, a moment of stress, a cultural expectation he hadn't fully examined. I told myself that intent mattered more than impact, and his intent, I believed, was good. When he talked about the future, he used words like efficient and logical. He framed our choices as practical solutions to hypothetical problems. If one of us had to be flexible, it made sense that it would be me. My job, after all, was stable, predictable, replaceable, though he never used that word. And because I had spent years being praised for my practicality, I recognized the language. It was the same language people used when they wanted me to accommodate without protest. The same tone that suggested resistance would be emotional rather than rational. So I adapted. I began to soften my responses. I stopped correcting assumptions in real time. When he spoke about my job as if it were optional, I responded with non-committal phrases. We'll see. That's a conversation for later. Things might change. Each time I deferred, the assumption solidified. It wasn't just him. Friends would ask about our plans and direct practical questions toward him. His career trajectory, his workload, his goals. When they turned to me, it was usually to ask how I felt about supporting those plans, how flexible I was, whether I'd thought about taking a step back eventually. I answered politely. I smiled. I gave answers that kept the room comfortable. I told myself this was temporary, that once things settled, I'd assert myself more clearly, that timing mattered, that pushing back too early would create unnecessary tension. There's a particular kind of rationalization that sounds like maturity. It tells you that choosing peace is wisdom, that discomfort is optional, that not every assumption deserves a response. But over time, silence stops being neutral. I started noticing how often I edited myself, how I framed my work achievements as small or incidental, how I avoided talking about long-term ambitions, how I instinctively minimized anything that might complicate the narrative forming around us. I wasn't being asked to quit my job yet. That was important to me. As long as it hadn't been formalized, I could pretend my autonomy was intact, but the groundwork was being laid. Through repetition, through normalization, through my own compliance. The most unsettling part was how reasonable it all sounded. No one was demanding sacrifice. They were praising it in advance. No one was questioning my worth. They were redefining it. I told myself that marriage involved trade-offs, that partnership meant prioritizing the whole over the individual. And while that's true in theory, I avoided one uncomfortable question. Who decides what gets traded? Every time I swallowed a reaction, I told myself I was choosing patience, that I was gathering context, that I was being strategic. And maybe part of me was. But another part was afraid. Afraid of being seen as difficult. Afraid of disrupting a relationship that looks stable from the outside. Afraid of discovering that my value was conditional on my willingness to shrink. So I stayed quiet. I normalized the comments by repeating them to myself until they lost their sharpness. I explained them away. I absorbed them as background noise. And yet I remembered everyone. They accumulated not as anger, but as data. Each remark clarified the role I was expected to play. Each assumption revealed the limits of how I was seen. I wasn't being asked who I wanted to be. I was being prepared to become what was needed. At the time, I believed I was being flexible, mature, loving. Only later did I understand that I was training everyone around me, including myself, to expect less resistance than I was actually capable of. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as a pattern you're encouraged to accept because it feels normal, reasonable, and socially approved. By the time I recognized that pattern for what it was, it no longer felt small. It felt rehearsed. It didn't happen all at once. The realization arrived in fragments, in moments that didn't seem connected until they were. One evening, we were at a small gathering with friends. Nothing formal, just dinner and conversation. Someone asked about our plans for the next few years. Before I could answer, my husband spoke. He talked about career growth, possible relocations, long hours, and bigger responsibilities. Everyone nodded along. When he finished, there was a brief pause, and then someone turned to me and said, "Well, at least you'll have flexibility." It was said kindly, almost supportively. I smiled and nodded, the way I always did. But inside, something clicked into place. Flexibility wasn't being offered as a choice. It was being assigned as a trait, a function. I started noticing how often decisions were framed around my availability. Schedules assumed I could adjust. Plans relied on my ability to fill gaps. Emotional labor defaulted to me. I was the one expected to remember birthdays, manage logistics, smooth over conflicts, and anticipate needs before they were expressed. And because I did these things well, no one questioned the arrangement. There was a role being written for me, and I was performing it flawlessly. The role wasn't cruel. That's what made it dangerous. It was framed as supportive, nurturing, and sensible. I was the stabilizer, the buffer, the one whose life could bend without breaking because it was supposedly less rigid to begin with. My work life was spoken about as if it were a convenience rather than a commitment. Something I did until something more important required my attention. Something that could be paused, reduced, or removed without consequence. When I tried to articulate discomfort, even gently, it was met with reassurance rather than curiosity. "You're so good at handling things. You don't seem unhappy. You always adapt." Those statements weren't observations. There were instructions. I realized that I had been cast as the reliable background structure against which everyone else's ambitions could stand out. I made the environment stable enough that no one had to consider the cost of their assumptions. And I had helped create that role. I had trained people to expect consistency without negotiation. I had rewarded assumptions by accommodating them. I had mistaken being needed for being respected. The hardest part was acknowledging my own participation. It would have been easier if the role had been forced on me, if someone had explicitly told me to step aside. But this role had been co-authored, line by line, through my silence. I wasn't being ignored, I was being utilized. There's a difference. Utilization feels validating at first. It comes with praise, gratitude, a sense of purpose, but it leaves very little room for self-definition. I started to see how rarely anyone asked me what I wanted, not because they didn't care, but because they believed they already knew. I was the one who would make it work, the one who wouldn't object, the one whose desires were reasonable as long as they aligned with existing plans. And I realized something else, too. If I continued playing this role, it wouldn't just shape how others treated me. It would shape who I became. I began to imagine a future where my life was permanently structured around someone else's priorities, where my work faded not because I chose it, but because it was quietly deprioritized out of existence, where my identity narrowed until it fit neatly into the expectations already placed on me. That future didn't arrive as fear, it arrived as clarity. I could see the role clearly now, reliable, useful, invisible. And once you see a role for what it is, you have a choice, whether to keep performing it or to step back and let the silence do something different. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. I didn't disrupt the script. I simply stopped assuming that the role assigned to me was the one I had to keep. That was the beginning. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic realization that split my life in two before and after. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so small it would have been easy to forget, if it hadn't changed everything. I was alone in the apartment, working from the dining table. Papers spread out, laptop open, phone turned face down. Outside, the light was fading into that muted gray that makes time feel suspended. I remember pausing, not because I was tired, but because I suddenly felt strangely distant from what I was doing, as if I were watching myself from somewhere else. I thought about the version of my future that had been quietly drafted around me. In that version, my work slowly receded. Not abruptly, no one would force me. It would just become less urgent, less central, until eventually it seemed unnecessary to continue. In that version, I would be praised for letting go, for being supportive, for choosing what really matters. And for the first time, I didn't ask whether that version was reasonable. I asked whether it was mine. That question landed differently. It didn't come with panic or anger. It came with a steady, uncomfortable calm. The kind that doesn't demand immediate action, but doesn't allow denial either. I realized I had been measuring my choices against other people's comfort. I had been evaluating my future based on how little disruption it caused. And I had never actually sat with the possibility that I might quietly refuse without explanation. Do not argue, not justify, not persuade, just not comply. That afternoon, I closed my laptop and took out a notebook I hadn't used in months. I didn't write a manifesto. I didn't outline a plan. I wrote one sentence, slowly, carefully, as if testing whether it was allowed to exist. I am not obligated to disappear in order to be loved. Seeing it in my own handwriting did something to me. It wasn't empowering in the cinematic sense. It was grounding, like finding a solid footing after standing too long on something unstable. I didn't tell my husband about this moment. There was nothing to tell. No decision had been announced. No boundary had been drawn out loud, but internally something had shifted from passive endurance to quiet ownership. I started paying attention to my reactions instead of suppressing them. Not expressing them yet, just noticing. I observed how my body tightened when my work was dismissed casually, how I felt smaller when plans were made without me, how relief followed moments when I imagined saying no, even silently. That relief told me more than any argument could have. I understood then that confrontation wasn't my first step. Clarity was. I didn't need to convince anyone yet. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was being asked to give up and whether I was willing to give it. I needed to stop confusing peace with self-erasure. That day marked the end of something, though no one else knew it. The end of my assumption that expectations were harmless if they were unspoken. The end of my belief that love naturally required contraction. Nothing in my external life changed immediately. I still smiled, I still listened, I still fulfilled my role. But internally, I was no longer performing unconsciously. I had stopped drifting. From that point on, every silence became deliberate. Every accommodation became a choice rather than a reflex. And that difference, subtle as it was, began to change how I moved through my own life. The shift wasn't loud, it was irreversible. After that day, I didn't suddenly become outspoken. I didn't correct every assumption or challenge every comment. From the outside, I probably looked the same. Calm, accommodating, unchanged. But silence feels different when it's chosen. Before, my quietness had been reactive, a way to avoid discomfort, a habit shaped by years of being rewarded for not complicating things. Now it has become intentional. I listened more closely. I responded less automatically. I let conversations reveal themselves fully before stepping in, if I stepped in at all. My husband didn't notice the shift. That wasn't surprising. People rarely notice changes that don't disrupt them. When he talked about future plans, I didn't interrupt to clarify. I didn't offer reassurance either. I let his assumptions sit in the air, unsupported. Sometimes he filled the silence himself, elaborating. Sometimes he moved on, satisfied that things were understood. What he interpreted as agreement was actually observation. I was learning how decisions were made when I wasn't actively maintaining equilibrium. I was watching how often my silence was taken as consent, how comfortable everyone had become assuming my adaptability. At work, I did something similar. I stopped volunteering extra explanations. I let my contributions stand on their own. I paid attention to how much I gave versus how much was expected. I began documenting, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for reality. Silence gave me clarity. It created space for patterns to emerge. People often mistake quiet for weakness because they assume power announces itself. But restraint can be a form of control, especially when you're used to being the one who smooths things over. There were moments when my husband would pause, as if expecting me to fill in emotional gaps the way I always had. When I didn't, he seemed slightly unsettled. Not angry, just unsure. He would ask if everything was okay. I would say yes, and it was true. Everything was okay. I was no longer leaking energy into maintaining an image. Friends still spoke to me as if my future were flexible. I didn't correct them. Not yet. I needed to understand how deeply the assumption ran. I needed to see what would happen if I stopped reinforcing it. What happened was simple. Nothing changed. And that, too, was information. Silence, I learned, is revealing. It shows you who checks in and who proceeds, who notices the absence and who benefits from it, who sees you as a participant and who sees you as infrastructure. I wasn't being punished for my quiet. I was being relied on more efficiently. And instead of resenting that, I noted it. This wasn't about playing games or withholding affection. It was about shifting my center of gravity back to myself, about choosing not to correct misunderstandings that I didn't create and that I no longer felt responsible for managing. I started to feel something unfamiliar, steadiness without self-sacrifice. The more I observed, the less urgent the confrontation felt. I realized that clarity gave me options. Silence gave me leverage, not over others, but over my own responses. By not rushing to explain myself, I was no longer negotiating my existence in real time. I was allowing people to show me exactly how they saw me when I wasn't actively shaping the narrative. And what they showed me confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't listening to my voice. They were listening for my compliance. Understanding that changed how I valued my silence. It was no longer a void to be filled. It was a boundary that didn't require announcement. Others mistook it for weakness. I knew better. What no one noticed during that period was how much I was paying attention. Because nothing about my behavior had changed dramatically, there was no reason for anyone to suspect that something fundamental had shifted. I still showed up. I still handled responsibilities. I still participated in conversations the way I always had. But internally, I was moving differently. I began to document things, not out of paranoia and not with any single outcome in mind. It started as a way of grounding myself. Writing down conversations helped me separate what was actually said from how it was later reframed. It helped me see patterns without emotion distorting them. Dates, phrases, assumptions repeated in different contexts. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building clarity for myself. At the same time, I quietly strengthened parts of my life that had been treated as secondary. I invested more seriously in my professional skills. I updated certifications I'd been postponing. I took on projects that increased my independence rather than my visibility. Work that deepened my leverage without drawing attention. None of this was announced. There was no reason to. At home, I paid closer attention to how finances were discussed. Not just numbers, but language. Who was assumed to decide? What was considered shared? What was framed as temporary? I asked questions occasionally, not confrontational ones, just neutral clarifications. I listened carefully to the answers. Information has weight when you don't rush to use it. I also noticed how often my emotional labor went unacknowledged, how smoothly things functioned because I anticipated needs before they became problems. I didn't stop doing these things abruptly. I simply became aware of their value and the fact that no one else was tracking them. That awareness mattered. Because once you know what you contribute, you can decide whether to continue giving it under the same terms. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. But internally, I was repositioning myself from someone who absorbed expectations to someone who evaluated them. I stopped imagining conversations where I defended my choices. I stopped rehearsing explanations. Instead, I asked myself quieter questions. What do I need to feel intact? What am I willing to compromise? What am I not? The answers didn't arrive all at once. They accumulated slowly through consistency rather than intensity. What surprised me most was how invisible preparation is to people who assume stability. Because I wasn't threatening the existing order, no one felt the need to monitor me. No one questioned my autonomy because they believed it was already accounted for. That belief gave me time. I also began to understand something uncomfortable. If I ever did speak plainly, it would sound sudden to them. Not because it was, but because they hadn't been listening. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I wasn't preparing to leave in the dramatic sense. I was preparing to remain whole regardless of what others decided. I was ensuring that my survival didn't depend on being agreeable. Quietly, I made sure I could stand on my own without announcing that fact to anyone else. And still no one noticed. They saw continuity. I felt readiness. By the time they would eventually realize something had changed, the groundwork would already be complete. That was the advantage of being underestimated. The realization didn't arrive as excitement. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of winning. It came quietly, like the moment you finally understand a map you've been staring at for a long time. I was reviewing my notes one evening. Nothing urgent, just patterns I'd been tracking for myself. Conversations, financial arrangements, assumptions repeated often enough that they had begun to feel permanent. I wasn't looking for leverage. I wasn't searching for an escape. I was looking for the truth. And what became clear, almost embarrassingly slowly, was this. I was far less trapped than I had been led to believe. My work, which had been spoken about as optional, was not marginal at all. It was stable, portable, and increasingly valuable. I had skills that didn't depend on my husband's network or approval. I had income that wasn't symbolic. It was real, sustainable, and mine. More importantly, I had kept it that way. Because I had never formally relinquished control, because I had never agreed out loud to step back, my independence hadn't eroded legally or practically. It had only been assumed away socially. That distinction mattered. I looked at our shared finances with new eyes. I wasn't dependent. I was contributing consistently, quietly. And yet the narrative surrounding money framed him as the provider and me as the auxiliary. It wasn't true, but it had been convenient. I also saw how much emotional labor I carried without recognition, how many systems functioned because I maintained them, how often was attributed to him simply because his role was more visible. None of this made me angry. Anger would have pushed me toward confrontation before I was ready. What I felt instead was something steadier, clarity without urgency. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to expose assumptions. I didn't need to correct the story yet, because I finally understood my position. The leverage wasn't about power over someone else. It was about power over myself, about knowing that my well-being did not depend on permission, agreement, or validation. That night, I slept deeply. The next morning, nothing changed on the surface. I went to work, I answered messages, I participated in conversations that continued to frame my life as flexible. But inside, the tone had shifted. I was no longer quietly hoping to be seen. I had stopped waiting for recognition to legitimize my choices. I knew what I was capable of sustaining on my own, and that knowledge made external expectations feel less heavy. There was a calm that came with that understanding, not relief exactly. Relief implies release from pressure. This felt more like alignment. I began to see future conversations differently, not as moments where I needed to defend myself, but as points of information, signals, indicators of whether others were capable of adjusting their assumptions when faced with reality. If they couldn't, I already knew what that meant. The private reveal wasn't something I shared. It wasn't something I announced. It lived entirely within me. And that was enough. Because once you know you're standing on solid ground, you don't need to convince anyone else of it. You just need to decide where you're willing to stand and where you're not. Clarity changes the nature of choice. Once I understood my position, I could no longer pretend that time alone would resolve things. Awareness demands response, even if that response is quiet. I reached a point where I had to decide, not in public, not out loud, but internally, what I was willing to live with. There were several paths available to me. I could continue as things were, maintain the role I'd been assigned, preserve harmony, let my work slowly become less central until it disappeared under the weight of expectation. No one would stop me. In fact, I would be praised for it. That path promised ease and approval at the cost of something I could no longer name lightly. I could confront the issue directly, sit down, explain how I felt, and ask for renegotiation. That option appealed to logic, but not to reality. Because confrontation assumes mutual listening, it assumes curiosity rather than defense. And I had enough data now to know how deeply the assumptions ran. I could also do something subtler. I could choose a direction that didn't require permission, a choice that wouldn't ask others to understand before it became real. That was the irreversible one. The decision wasn't dramatic. It unfolded over days, maybe weeks. I tested it in my mind from every angle. I asked myself whether I was acting out of fear or integrity, whether I was protecting myself or avoiding discomfort, whether this choice aligned with my values or merely preserved my pride. What ultimately guided me was a simple truth. Any future that required me to continuously justify my existence was not a future I wanted. I didn't announce my decision when I made it. I didn't even label it as final. But once it settled, it felt immovable. I decided that my work would remain non-negotiable, not as a talking point, but as a fact. I would not preemptively downplay it. I would not frame it as temporary. I would let reality speak first. I also decided that I would stop cushioning others from the consequences of their assumptions. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't correct gently. I would allow misalignments to surface naturally. This wasn't punishment, it was honesty. The irreversible part wasn't what I planned to do next. It was what I refused to do again. I would no longer shrink to maintain someone else's certainty. That decision didn't come with relief. It came with resolve. the kind that doesn't seek validation because it's anchored in self-respect rather than outcome. I knew that once I acted on it, some things couldn't be undone. Expectations would collide with reality. Comfort would be disrupted, and not everyone would respond well. But I also knew something else. If I didn't choose myself now, I would spend the rest of my life explaining why I hadn't. The decision point isn't always visible to others. Sometimes it exists entirely within you, long before the world catches up. And once you cross it, even quietly, there's no real going back. Once the decision was settled, action followed, not in bursts, but in increments. Quiet ones, the kind that don't register as change unless you know exactly where to look. I didn't make announcements. I didn't issue ultimatums. I simply began to align my life with the decision I'd already made internally. The first things I adjusted were practical. I reviewed my financial accounts with a level of precision I hadn't needed before. Not because there was a crisis, but because clarity deserves structure. I ensured that my income flowed cleanly, transparently, and independently. I documented contributions, not as ammunition, but as acknowledgement of reality. I didn't hide what I was doing, I just didn't narrate it. At work, I accepted a project that expanded my responsibilities in a way that couldn't be reframed as temporary. It required commitment, visibility, continuity. I didn't frame it as a negotiation at home. I treated it as a fact. When my husband noticed the increased workload, he commented on it casually. "Things are getting busy for you." "Yes," I said, and nothing more. I was careful with my energy. I stopped absorbing logistical slack that wasn't mine to carry, not abruptly, just enough to recalibrate expectations. When something wasn't handled, I didn't rush to fix it automatically. I allowed systems to reveal where they depended on me. No one noticed at first. That's the thing about invisible labor. Its absence takes time to register. Legally, I educated myself, not with the intention to leave, but with the intention to understand. Knowledge is not a threat, ignorance is. I learned where I stood, what was shared, what was separate, and what choices existed in theory versus practice. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. There was nothing secretive about it. It just wasn't their process to manage. Emotionally, I began to disengage from rehearsing outcomes. I stopped imagining how conversations might go. I stopped bracing myself for reactions that hadn't happened yet. I focused instead on what I could control: my preparedness, my integrity, my alignment. There was a quiet confidence in that phase, not arrogance, not detachment, just steadiness. My husband continued to speak about the future in familiar ways. I didn't contradict him. I didn't confirm him either. I let the dissonance grow slowly, naturally, until it could no longer be ignored. Silence, when paired with action, has weight, and still no one noticed. From the outside, everything looked stable, predictable, even comfortable. But beneath that surface, I was no longer cushioning the narrative. I was letting reality accumulate. This wasn't manipulation, it was a restraint. By the time questions would eventually arise, the foundation would already be in place. Not to trap anyone, but to ensure that when the truth surfaced, it couldn't be dismissed as impulse or emotion. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about refusing to explain yourself before you're ready, especially to people who haven't earned that access. And in that quiet, I felt something settle into place. I wasn't preparing for conflict. I was preparing for the truth. The first signs didn't look like conflict. They looked confused. It started with small disruptions. Moments where things no longer flowed as smoothly as they used to. A missed detail, a forgotten follow-up, an expectation unmet. Nothing dramatic enough to accuse, but enough to unsettle. My husband noticed first in fragments. He asked if I was tired more often, if work was stressing me out, if something was off. His questions weren't hostile. They were disoriented. He was sensing a shift in the emotional climate without understanding its source. I answered honestly, but narrowly. "Work is busy. I'm fine. Just a lot on my plate." All of that was true. What I didn't do was fill in the gaps the way I used to. I didn't reassure him preemptively. I didn't smooth over his unease. I allowed it to exist. That was new. At home, systems that had quietly depended on me began to falter. Schedules overlapped. Minor responsibilities went unattended longer than usual. When he noticed, he reacted with mild frustration, then confusion. Not because things were difficult, but because they had always been easy. Because I had made them easy, he would ask, "Did you already handle this?" And for the first time, the answer was sometimes no. Not out of spite, out of accuracy. I watched as he recalibrated in real time, trying to locate the source of the change. His first instinct was external. Work, stress, timing, anything except the possibility that the balance had shifted intentionally. Friends noticed too, though less clearly. I was less available, less responsive. Not distant, just no longer orbiting everyone else's needs. Invitations were declined without elaborate explanations. Emotional support was offered without overextension. Some people adjusted, others felt the absence without knowing what to name it. Loss is disorienting when you didn't realize you were relying on something. What struck me most was how quickly discomfort surfaced when my role became less reliable. Not anger. Entitlement rarely announces itself that way. Instead, there was disappointment, confusion, a subtle sense that something was missing. No one asked directly what had changed. They asked why things felt harder. And that distinction mattered, because it revealed that my presence had been assumed, not appreciated. My contributions had been background conditions, not conscious choices others were aware of. I didn't correct that perception. I let the consequences unfold at their own pace. There was a moment, small but telling, when my husband expressed irritation that I hadn't anticipated something he needed. He didn't accuse me. He sounded surprised, as if the system had malfunctioned. I listened. I didn't apologize reflexively. I asked a neutral question instead. "Did you ask me?" He paused. The question hadn't occurred to him. That pause told me everything. The consequences weren't explosive, they were cumulative. Each moment of friction revealed how much had been smoothed over before. Each inconvenience traced back to an expectation that had never been renegotiated, only relied upon. And still, no one framed this as my withdrawal. They framed it as a disruption. That's often how it feels when someone stops compensating for an imbalance. I didn't feel guilty. Guilt belongs to wrongdoing. What I felt was steadiness. The quiet confirmation that my silence, paired with action, was making the invisible visible. Not through accusation, through absence. And as the consequences continued to surface, I understood something important. They weren't reacting to who I was becoming. They were reacting to who I was no longer willing to be. By the time the concern became explicit, the ground had already shifted. It began with conversations that circled without landing. Questions that didn't quite ask what needed to be asked. My husband started referencing us differently, not as a certainty, but as something that needed attention. He suggested check-ins, adjustments, rebalancing. The language changed before the understanding did. He sensed that something important was no longer where he left it, that the ease he had relied on had thinned, and for the first time he seemed unsure whether it would return on its own. There was a note of urgency now. Not panic, yet, but alertness. A sense that if something wasn't addressed soon, it might solidify into something harder to reach. He asked if I was unhappy. I thought about that question carefully before answering. Unhappiness implies dissatisfaction with circumstances. What I felt was different. "I'm clear," I said. He didn't know what to do with that. Clarity is unsettling when someone is used to flexibility. He began offering solutions, practical ones, compromises he hadn't considered before. He spoke about supporting my work more, about adjusting timelines, about how maybe things didn't have to change as much as he'd assumed. It was all very reasonable, and it was all too late. Not because the offers were insincere, but because they were reactive. They emerged not from understanding, but from discomfort. From the realization that the arrangement he'd been counting on was no longer guaranteed. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I noticed how every solution still preserved the original assumption that my autonomy was negotiable, something to be granted or adjusted rather than recognized as fundamental. What he was trying to fix wasn't my dissatisfaction, it was his uncertainty. That's when confusion crept in. He couldn't understand why his willingness now didn't feel reassuring to me. Why did his flexibility feel conditional? Why wasn't I relieved? Because relief comes from being seen, not from being accommodated after resistance becomes inconvenient. There was a moment when he said quietly, "I didn't realize this mattered so much to you." I believed him, and that was the problem. By the time something has to be defended, it's already been discounted once. I explained myself calmly, not with a list of grievances, but with clarity. I spoke about assumptions, about consent, about how silence had been mistaken for agreement, about how my work was not a phase, not a placeholder, not something to be weighed against someone else's comfort. He listened, he nodded. He said he understood. But understanding arrived too late to undo what had already been set in motion. Because while he was just beginning to see me clearly, I had already finished deciding who I was willing to be. The imbalance wasn't something that could be corrected with conversation alone. It had been normalized for too long. It had shaped expectations, habits, and identities. And I had already stepped out of the role that made it possible. There was regret in his voice, not theatrical, not manipulative, real regret. The kind that comes from realizing you misread something essential. I felt no satisfaction in that, only finality. Some things can be repaired when both people are willing to reimagine the foundation together, but that requires recognition before the foundation cracks. By the time he wanted to fix it, I no longer needed fixing. What I needed had already been secured, and that's when I knew. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be a return. It would be a reckoning. I explained that what changed wasn't my tolerance, but my awareness. That once I understood the role I was expected to play, I could no longer play it unconsciously, and that continuing to do so would have meant erasing something essential. He asked if I had ever planned to tell him earlier. I answered honestly, I was listening first. That landed quietly. I told him I wasn't angry, and that was true. Anger would have implied that I was still negotiating. What I felt was resolve. "I'm not asking for permission to keep my life," I said. "I'm telling you that I already have." There was a long pause after that, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. He asked what this meant for us. I didn't dramatize the answer. I didn't predict outcomes. I told him what I knew. It means I won't agree to a future where my work, my autonomy, or my identity is conditional. It means I won't shrink to make things easier. And it means that if we move forward, it has to be without assumptions. He nodded, slowly. He said he wished he had understood sooner. "I know," I said. That was all. There was no explosion because there was nothing left to release. I had already processed the grief privately, the disappointment, the recalibration of expectation. What remained was clarity. Confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes it's quiet because the decision has already been made internally. We didn't resolve everything that night. We didn't need to. Resolution implies negotiation. This was alignment, or the recognition that alignment might not be possible. I wasn't demanding agreement, I was stating reality. And for the first time, he understood that my calm wasn't flexibility. It was a conclusion. What followed wasn't chaos. It wasn't relief either. It was quieter than both. After that conversation, I didn't feel the need to explain myself anymore. Not to him, not to anyone else. I had already articulated my truth clearly, and repeating it would have implied doubt. I noticed how my body felt different. Lighter, but not euphoric. More grounded, as if I were finally standing in a position that didn't require constant adjustment. Who I am now isn't radically different from who I was before. I'm still observant, still calm, still deliberating, but the center has shifted. I no longer confuse being easy to be around with being easy to remove. My work remains part of my life, not as an act of defiance, but as an expression of continuity. It's not a statement. It's simply mine. I no longer downplay it. I no longer frame it as something I do for now. I let it exist at full size. In my relationships, I've become more selective with my energy. I don't preemptively accommodate expectations that haven't been discussed. I ask clarifying questions. I let silence do its work, not as a tactic, but as a filter. People respond differently to this version of me. Some lean in with curiosity, others pull back slightly, unsure of where they stand now that I'm not smoothing the edges for them. I don't take either response personally. What I've learned is that self-respect doesn't require performance. It requires consistency. There's no bitterness in me toward my husband. He was operating within a framework he'd never been asked to question. I don't need him to be a villain to validate my experience. I don't need to rewrite the past to justify my present. I've let go of the need to be understood by everyone involved. Understanding is not a prerequisite for autonomy. What matters is that I recognize myself again. Not the version of me that was useful, but the version that is intact. If there's a lesson in this part of the story, it's not about leaving or staying. It's about refusing to disappear quietly. About noticing when love starts to feel like contraction rather than expansion. I didn't become louder. I became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, changes the shape of everything around it, even when nothing else seems to move. If you've listened this far, I want to say this gently. This story was never about choosing work over love or independence over partnership. It was about choosing presence over erasure. For a long time, I believed that being reasonable meant making myself smaller. That harmony required accommodation without consent. That love, if it was sincere, would naturally justify quiet sacrifices, even the ones no one explicitly asked for. I know now that those beliefs were incomplete. Love can be kind and still be careless. It can be well-intentioned and still rely on assumptions that harm. And when those assumptions go unexamined, they don't announce themselves as control. They arrive as normal, as tradition, as practicality. That's why this story unfolded quietly. Because the most dangerous expectations are the ones no one thinks to question. What I learned is this: love shouldn't require erasure. Not of your work, not of your voice, not of the parts of you that existed long before someone else imagined a future around them. Silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's observation. Sometimes it's preparation. And sometimes it's the space where clarity forms. If there's one moral I hope stays with you, it's this: pay attention to the roles you're praised for playing, especially if those roles require you to be endlessly flexible, endlessly supportive, endlessly invisible. Appreciation without agency is not respect. You don't need to justify your existence by being easy to accommodate. You don't need permission to remain whole. And you don't owe anyone a smaller version of yourself to make their plans feel secure. This story didn't end with revenge or victory. It ended with alignment. With the quiet confidence that comes from standing where you actually belong, not where you're expected to stand. If you're in a place right now where expectations are being placed on you without your explicit consent, I hope this story reminds you that noticing is the first act of self-respect. You don't have to confront immediately. You don't have to explain everything at once. But you do have to listen to yourself. Thank you for sitting with this story, for staying with the quiet moments, and for allowing space for reflection rather than reaction. I'd like to leave you with a question, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that something expected of you felt normal to everyone else, but cost you more than anyone noticed? That's where these conversations begin.